The night the ice storm locked down Millbrook County, 17 people stood shivering outside Diane Kramer's farmhouse, begging to be let inside a root cellar they had spent 6 months calling a waste of time and money. The same root cellar Gary Hendricks had joked about at the feed store, saying Diane was preparing for a nuclear war that would never come. The same one Pastor Sullivan had gently suggested might indicate she was letting fear control her life. Now they stood in the dark, their own pantries bare, their backup generators silent, their pipes frozen solid, staring at the only door in the county behind which food and warmth still existed. But that moment came later. It started 4 months earlier, on a summer afternoon so ordinary that nobody in Millbrook thought twice about the woman buying concrete reinforcement materials at Fletcher's Hardware. Diane Kramer had lived alone on the old Kramer property since her husband passed 3 years prior. 51 years old, lean from farm work, with calloused hands and silver threading through dark hair she kept tied back. She spoke when necessary and kept to herself otherwise. The kind of person people recognized but never really knew. Which was why it seemed strange when she hired contractors to excavate her root cellar. Not repair it. Excavate it. Completely. The root cellar had been on the property since her grandparents' time. A simple dugout space where vegetables once stayed cool through summer. Diane had them dig it 3 times deeper than it was, pour concrete walls, install proper drainage, and reinforce the ceiling with steel supports that looked excessive for storing potatoes. Building a bomb shelter? Gary Hendricks asked one morning when he drove past and saw the construction. Diane, standing beside the excavation in work boots and a faded flannel shirt, didn't smile. Building a pantry. That's a lot of concrete for canned goods. She turned back to the work without answering. Word spread through Millbrook the way it always did in farming towns. Through the co-op, the diner, the post office. Comments at first were curious, then skeptical, then openly mocking as Diane's project continued. She installed insulation rated for industrial freezers, thick enough that Gary measured it himself one afternoon and reported back to the feed store that she'd reduced her usable space by nearly 40%. Why would anyone do that? Someone asked. Because she's preparing for the end times, Gary said, drawing laughs. She brought in ventilation equipment designed for underground structures. Not simple air vents, but a system with filters, fans, and backup power connections that cost more than most people's annual heating bills. Ventilation for what? Linda Morris asked at the diner. It's a root cellar, not a submarine. Diane added a reinforced door. Steel core, weather-stripped, with a locking mechanism that belonged on a bank vault. Then she lined the interior walls with shelving units bolted directly into concrete, floor to ceiling, built to hold serious weight. By late summer, people had stopped asking questions and started making assumptions. Pastor Sullivan mentioned her gently during a church social, suggesting that perhaps Diane was struggling with anxiety after her husband's death, that sometimes grief manifested as excessive worry about the future. She's always been a little off, someone murmured in agreement. But Diane continued, methodical and unbothered. She bought supplies in bulk from 3 counties away. Canned vegetables, dried beans, rice, flour, salt, sugar, cooking oil. Cases of it. Truckloads delivered to her property and carried by hand down into the cellar until the shelves began to fill with an inventory that looked less like household storage and more like commercial warehousing. She installed a wood-burning stove with a chimney that vented through a concealed pipe, barely visible above ground. She added water barrels, medical supplies, batteries, lanterns, tools. Everything organized with labels and rotation dates marked in neat handwriting. Gary stopped by one afternoon in September, ostensibly to check on a fence line near her property. Really, he wanted to see what she was doing. Diane was carrying another case of canned tomatoes toward the cellar entrance. You expecting to feed an army down there? He asked. She set the case down carefully. Expecting to be ready if I need to be. Ready for what? Whatever comes. Gary shook his head, grinning. Nothing's coming, Diane. This isn't 1918. We've got supply chains, emergency services, FEMA. You're wasting your money. Diane looked at him steadily. I hope you're right. But her tone suggested she didn't believe he was. By October, the root cellar was finished. Fully stocked, climate-controlled, organized with the precision of someone who had thought through every detail. Diane tested the ventilation, checked the door seals, inventoried her supplies, and then went back to her regular routines as if nothing unusual had happened. Meanwhile, Millbrook settled into autumn. Harvest came and went. Temperatures dropped. The first frost arrived on schedule. Life continued exactly as it always had, comfortable and predictable, with no reason to believe the winter ahead would be anything other than routine. Until the forecast changed. Subtly at first. A system moving in from the north, colder than expected. Then updates clarifying the system wasn't moving through, it was stalling. Temperatures predicted to drop into ranges usually reserved for the Arctic. Ice warnings issued for regions that rarely saw significant ice at all. Diane listened to every update. She filled her water barrels completely, brought in extra firewood, checked her supplies one final time. Then she locked the farmhouse, walked down into the root cellar, and sealed the door behind her while the sky above Millbrook began to darken. The ice came on a Tuesday night, quiet and surgical. Not the dramatic arrival of a blizzard, but something more insidious. Freezing rain that coated every surface in a thickening shell, building layer by layer until power lines sagged under weight they were never designed to carry, until tree branches cracked and fell across roads, until the entire county transformed into a landscape of glass. Diane sat below ground, listening to faint creaks and groans from above as ice accumulated on her property. The root cellar remained stable, temperature holding steady at 58 degrees. The wood stove radiated gentle heat. Lanterns provided soft light across shelves stocked with enough food to last months. Above ground, Millbrook began to fracture. Power failed first in the outer sections of the county, then cascaded inward as transformers overloaded and lines snapped. Within 6 hours, the entire grid went dark. Backup generators kicked in across town, but most weren't designed for extended use. They ran through the night, then began to fail as fuel supplies ran low and cold temperatures thickened diesel in storage tanks. By Wednesday morning, the temperature had dropped to 12 degrees and was still falling. Inside homes built for comfort rather than crisis, heat bled away faster than fireplaces could replace it. Pipes froze. Furnaces failed. Families burned furniture to stay warm. Gary Hendricks tried to drive into town for supplies Wednesday afternoon. His truck slid off the road before he made it half a mile, wedged against a ditch beneath a fallen tree. He walked back home, boots slipping on ice, face burning from wind that felt like broken glass. His wife met him at the door. Grocery store. Couldn't get there. He stamped snow from his boots. Roads are gone. Their generator ran for another 8 hours before sputtering into silence. Gary checked the fuel line, already knowing what he'd find. The diesel had gelled solid in the cold. Inside the house, temperature began to drop immediately. 45 degrees by midnight. 38 by dawn Thursday. Their breath visible in the kitchen. Ice forming on the inside of windows. "We can't stay here," his wife said, wrapped in 3 blankets. Gary stared at the fireplace, burning the last of their firewood. "Where else is there?" She didn't answer, but they both thought the same thing. The same image that had been circulating through Millbrook since the power failed. Diane Kramer's property. The root cellar everyone had mocked. The underground space that didn't depend on electricity or fuel deliveries or supply chains. The place that might still have heat, and food, and safety. Thursday afternoon, Gary made the decision. He and his wife bundled in every layer they owned and started walking. 2 miles across frozen fields, boots breaking through ice crust with every step, wind cutting through fabric that was never meant for this kind of cold. They weren't alone. Others had the same idea. Pastor Sullivan and his family, Linda Morris and her adult son, the Chens from the hardware store, all moving slowly across the landscape toward the Kramer farm, drawn by desperation and the faint hope that the woman they dismissed might let them inside. Diane heard the first knock Thursday evening. Heavy, urgent pounding on the reinforced cellar door. She climbed the stairs and opened it to find Gary Hendricks standing in the twilight, ice coating his beard, eyes hollow with exhaustion and shame. "Diane." His voice cracked. "Our house is freezing. Generator's dead. We have nowhere else to go." She looked past him at his wife, shaking violently in the cold. Then at the others approaching across the field, dark shapes moving through the ice-covered dusk. For a long moment, she said nothing, just studied the man who had spent months making her the town's joke, who had laughed at her preparations and called her paranoid. "Please," Gary whispered. Diane stepped aside. "Get in." They stumbled down into warmth that felt impossible after days of brutal cold. The root cellar opened before them, larger than they'd imagined, organized like a small warehouse. Shelves lined every wall, stocked with food. Water barrels in the corner. The wood stove radiating steady heat. Blankets folded neatly on bunks built into the concrete. Gary's wife started crying immediately, overwhelmed by relief. More knocks came. Diane answered each one. Pastor Sullivan with his family. Linda Morris. The Chens. The Johnsons. One by one, she let them in, until 17 people crowded into a space built for maybe 6. Nobody spoke much that first night. They sat close to the stove, thawing slowly, drinking hot soup Diane prepared from her stores. Outside, the ice storm continued, temperatures plunging to -5. Inside, life continued because one person had prepared when everyone else assumed preparation was unnecessary. Friday morning, Gary found Diane organizing inventory near the shelves. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. She glanced at him. "You owe me nothing. Just tried to help. I made fun of you. At the feed store. At the diner. I told people you were crazy." Diane finished. "I know. Everyone did." Gary looked around the cellar. At the food. The warmth. The people who would have frozen without it. "You were right. About all of it." "I was cautious," Diane corrected. "There's a difference. Why didn't you say something? Warm people." She met his eyes. "Would you have listened?" Gary had no answer. Diane handed him a can of vegetables. "Make yourself useful. We need to ration carefully. Don't know how long this will last." The storm lasted 9 days. By the 9th day of the ice storm, Millbrook County had become a frozen wasteland that emergency crews described as the worst infrastructure collapse they'd seen in 20 years. But inside Diane Kramer's root cellar, 17 people had settled into routines that made survival possible because the woman they once mocked had built something that didn't just endure the crisis, it ignored it entirely. Diane organized everything with quiet authority. Meals prepared twice daily, portions measured carefully to make supplies last. Water rationed from the barrels, melted ice supplementing when necessary. Sleeping rotations on the bunks, everyone taking turns near the warmth of the stove. Chores assigned to keep people occupied and prevent panic from taking root. Gary helped maintain the ventilation system, clearing ice from the exterior intake when needed. Pastor Sullivan led evening prayers that gave people something to focus on beyond the cold. Linda Morris organized the children, keeping them calm with stories and simple games. The Chins monitored the wood supply, ensuring the stove never went out. Above ground, the world remained locked in ice. Trees snapped under the weight. Roads stayed impassable. Power lines lay buried beneath frozen debris. Emergency services couldn't reach Millbrook at all, the county completely isolated from outside help. But below ground, life continued with a stability that seemed impossible given the devastation overhead. On the 5th day, Mrs. Chone approached Diane while she was updating inventory logs by lantern light. "How did you know," she asked, "that something like this would happen?" Diane set down her pencil. "I didn't know this specifically, but I knew something would eventually. Always does. Most people don't prepare like you did. Most people trust systems to protect them." Diane gestured toward the ceiling, toward the frozen county above. "When systems fail, you need something else." Mrs. Chin studied the shelves around them, packed with supplies that had saved her family. "We laughed at you. I know. You let us in anyway." Diane looked at her steadily. "Wasn't about being right. Was about making sure people survived." On the 7th day, the children started showing signs of restlessness. Too many days underground, too much stale air, too much fear radiating from the adults around them. Diane noticed immediately. She gathered them near the stove and taught them how to organize supplies by rotation dates, turning inventory management into a game. She showed them how to maintain the lanterns, how to measure water rations, how to stack firewood efficiently. Gave them responsibilities that made them feel useful instead of helpless. Pastor Sullivan watched from across the cellar. "You're good with them." Diane shrugged. "They need something to do. Same as everyone else. You've thought of everything, haven't you?" "Tried to." She checked the stove temperature. "Can't prepare for absolutely everything, but you can cover the fundamentals." That night, Gary sat beside the stove while most of the others slept. Diane was awake, as she often was, keeping watch over systems that needed monitoring. "Can I ask you something?" Gary said quietly. She nodded. "When you were building this, Did you ever doubt it was worth it? All the money, all the work, all the jokes. Diane considered the question. Every time I carried another case of supplies down here, part of me wondered if I was wasting my time. If maybe everyone else was right, and I was just paranoid. But you kept going. Because the cost of being wrong was higher than the cost of being prepared. She adjusted a lantern wick. If I spent all that money and never needed this place, I lost some savings. If I didn't prepare and something happened, I lost everything. Gary stared at the concrete walls that had kept them alive. I wish I'd understood that before. Most people do, Diane said. On the 9th day, something changed. The constant drip of melting ice from the ventilation shaft slowed, then stopped. The temperature above ground stabilized instead of dropping further. Through the small vent, they heard a sound that made everyone stop what they were doing. Helicopters. Diane climbed the stairs and cracked open the reinforced door for the first time in over a week. Pale sunlight reflected off an ice-covered landscape that looked like another planet. In the distance, National Guard helicopters moved slowly across the sky while heavy equipment worked to clear main roads. Help had finally arrived. Over the next few hours, rescue crews worked their way through Millbrook, documenting damage and searching for survivors. What they found shocked even experienced disaster responders. Homes destroyed by frozen pipes and collapsed roofs. Families who had barely survived by burning furniture and wearing every piece of clothing they owned. Neighborhoods without power, heat, or running water for 9 straight days. And then they found the root cellar. The crew leader descended the stairs expecting the worst, and instead discovered 17 people in stable condition, warm, fed, organized. He stood in the doorway, taking in the shelves of supplies, the efficient heating system, the careful rationing charts on the wall. How long have you been down here? He asked Diane. Since the ice started. 9 days. He looked around again, calculating what he was seeing. You had all this prepared? Before the storm? Yes. The crew leader shook his head slowly. Ma'am, you probably saved every life in this room. Word spread fast once communications were restored. News crews arrived within 2 days, cameras documenting the root cellar that had sheltered 17 people through one of the worst ice storms in state history. Diane's story went regional, then national. The woman who prepared when no one else believed preparation mattered. But the moment that defined everything happened at the Millbrook Community Center 3 weeks later, during the first town meeting after power was restored. Gary Hendricks stood before the assembled residents, many still recovering from the storm, and spoke clearly into the microphone. I need to say something publicly, he began. For months, I made fun of Diane Kramer. I joked about her root cellar at the feed store. I called her paranoid. I laughed. He paused, emotion catching in his throat. And when everything failed, when my family was freezing and I had nowhere else to turn, she opened that door and let us in without hesitation. She saved our lives. All of us. He gestured toward the others who had sheltered below ground. We owe her more than we can repay. And we owe ourselves a hard look at why we mocked someone for being prepared. Silence filled the room. Not uncomfortable, but thoughtful. The kind of silence that precedes real change. In the months that followed, Millbrook transformed. Families built emergency supply stores. The county implemented disaster preparedness programs. Hardware stores sold out of insulation and backup heating systems. The root cellar became something people studied instead of ridiculed, a model of what self-reliance actually looked like. Diane returned to her quiet routines, restocking supplies, maintaining systems, working her land. But now when she went into town, people nodded with respect instead of whispering behind her back. One spring afternoon, Gary stopped by her property with a question. Would you be willing to teach a class? He asked. Show people how to do what you did. Diane considered it. People don't usually listen until after disaster proves they should have. Maybe, Gary said. But now they're ready to hear it. She looked across her fields, toward the root cellar entrance that had kept 17 people alive through impossible cold. All right, I'll teach them. But they need to understand something first. What's that? Preparation isn't about fear. It's about responsibility. You prepare because you owe it to yourself and the people who depend on you to be ready when things fall apart. Gary nodded slowly. I understand that now. Diane picked up a seed bag. Ready to return to work. Then we'll start next week. The root cellar stood as it always had, unassuming from above, essential below. And the woman who built it continued living as she always had, quietly, methodically, prepared. Because Diane Kramer understood something most people learn too late. The time to build shelter is before the storm arrives, not during it.